Okay, so this week we're going to be adding a little bit of accounting to the mix, since this class is medical calculations and accounting. The first discussion this week will be about the medical assistant's role in accounting. So that will be the topic you'll be researching and posting on. The second, however, is going to continue with our dosage calculations, and it will be related to flow rates. Good morning, Taylor. It will be related to flow rates for parenteral administration, meaning parenteral administration is injections. And when they talk about flow rates, they're talking about IV infusions. So we have to calculate either the setting on the infusion pump in milliliters per hour or the number of drops per minute that the patient will be receiving. So we'll go through that. We have, as usual, a Word document that's part of the assignment, which is about days supply and parenteral calculations. Parenteral just means bypassing the stomach. And there are lots of parenteral routes of administration. The important ones for us to think about here are injections. The chances of you actually setting an IV when you first go into work in a medical office are pretty close to zero. However, that doesn't mean you never will. So that's why, and you would be trained, because actually, although you either have or will take phlebotomy, the actual title of LBT 285 is IV therapy and phlebotomy. We do not teach IV therapy. Medical assistants rarely, without a lot of specific training, do that. Setting an IV is an art. It looks easy until you try it. I've had experienced, very much 20-year people who have been nurses and setting IVs for 20 years miss. And if you look at the veins in my arm, the idea that somebody would miss one of them is ludicrous. But they do. So we really, and if you do miss and you start pumping stuff into the tissues, it is extremely uncomfortable. Downright painful, in fact. So, we don't actually teach you to do that here because we really don't have any way of doing it properly. Much the same as doing phlebotomy or doing finger sticks for in-office tests. You really have to, or the injections class, you really have to practice on people. And we just don't have the setup to set an IV. So we don't teach that. So we will be discussing those flow rates. And the reason we will is because you will eventually need to be able to calculate them. But I want you to get an idea as to the logic that goes into those calculations. Because although the basis is exactly the same basis as we've had all along, the formula dV over H in any of its myriad forms, the logic that goes into determining what dV and H are is a little different. It was sort of like last week when we were looking at reconstituting a drug, and we had all sorts of numbers in the word problem. but most of the numbers were irrelevant. The only important thing was what you have at the end of the day when you actually reconstitute the drug. So we will be going through those calculations today. And on Thursday, we will do some in-class calculations of that nature. So, so let's start off with what questions do you have from last week? Okay. Taylor, B, any questions? Okay. Then let's move into the issues of this week. Later on this morning, probably before our first break maybe, I will give you copies of this week's assignment printout because, as usual, there are some things we need to correct on it. So I want you to do that. I want you to follow through with me on that and make those corrections. And along the way, the corrections themselves are not like the correction to the body surface area calculation last week. They're just the correction really is a step that was left out that needs to be done right at the end. So anyway, accounting. Why do we touch on accounting in this class? Well, as an assistant, you could find yourselves in one of two positions or possibly even fulfilling both. In a medical office, we have both clinical, which is our main training of you guys in this program is for clinical medical assisting. There's also administrative medical assisting. In small offices, you will find that it's possible that you'll have to share those duties between those two positions. In a larger practice, usually there are people at the front desk who are the administrative assistants. And then you have the clinical assistants in the clinic area of the practice. But you may find yourself having to do certain things. Some of those you are learning in some of the other classes you're taking, like insurance specialist and billing and coding and so forth. But in this particular class, this particular course, we're covering some aspects of the process. Next week, your assignment really will focus on using EHR Go, which we installed the other day, and looking at a patient account. Now, accounting is a process by which we keep track of two very important components of our business, income and expenses. Now, in a successful business, income is higher than expenses, the difference being what we call profit. And the accountant's job is to correctly categorize every single entry, every single source of income, every single source of expense, and to provide some analyses to the business owners as to the financial success of their business. We will not go into the nuts and bolts of accounting. Income is any source of money coming into the business, whether it be patient fees, whether it be payments from insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on deposits perhaps, or anything else. These are called credits in accounting term. The expenses are categorized as to where they are, whether they are capital expense, meaning on expensive items such as medical equipment that can cost thousands of dollars and which get what we call depreciated. Much like buying a car, if you buy a new car, a lot of people won't buy a new car because you buy a new car and the instant you turn it on to drive it out of the lot, it's worth several $1,000s less than you just paid for it. It's called depreciation. In a business setting, that depreciation affects the bottom line. Okay, and it depends. If we buy it, it's depreciated. We can also lease equipment. That's a business expense. It's also can be a capital expense. If we own our property, it's a capital expense. But all of these things are costs. Salaries for our physicians, for our PAs, NPs, nurses, MAs, everybody working in the office, those are expenses. Expenses are recorded in a balance sheet or in our accounting system. We call those debits because they are withdrawn from our account. Keeping track of those is important. Correctly recording all of those income and expense numbers is critical to the success of the business. If you miss them, there are downsides. Some of those downsides can even affect your tax statement, which every business has to file. And if you have mistakes on that, it can have sometimes severe consequences. The mistakes come when you don't properly keep the records. So part of the reason is to understand the necessity of recording everything. And then you let the accountant, because that's not what you're being trained in accounting, but you let the accountant figure out what to do with it. Accountants are well versed and well trained in these things. So that's why you'll be doing this. Now, you will, next week, you will be looking at something that actually you may end up dealing with in your career, which is a patient complaint. And the complaint, the two complaints, one is a real complaint about a bill that the patient thinks is improper, and you have to write a script as to what you'd say to the patient. And remember that no matter how unhappy the patient is, you need to be calm and cool and collected in dealing with them, because you don't want the patient then running to your boss and complaining that you're being rude. So the other is more of just a question. Why am I being charged this? Those of us who've had a little more training in finance, when we look at those bills, we can usually figure things out pretty well. But occasionally, you'll have problems. Sometimes the problems are related to the organization. Tell you a little story. When our younger daughter was born, she was 7 weeks premature, and she had to be transferred from the local county hospital in Durham, North Carolina, to the Duke University Medical Center, which is in Durham, because they had the only NICU in the area. However, she was impatient, and she was born in the ambulance on the way between the General Hospital and Duke. So we get the bill. And we actually get a couple of bills because it turns out that Duke has 2 billing offices that don't seem to be able to communicate with each other. But they billed us for a delivery room. She was born in the ambulance. So we had many, many disputes with them. They kept billing us and we kept saying, you've been paid. No, and you improperly charged us. We went through that argument for quite a while. I finally called my insurance company and said, don't pay this. You know, I have no idea if they did. Ultimately, Duke stopped billing me. But there are problems, and you need to be willing to speak up as a patient, but you have to remember that you're going to be dealing with patients. Fortunately, we went back and forth on this, and they just were absolutely not interested in listening to me. Well, it turned out that for various reasons, I was going to have a meeting with the chancellor of the medical school over some research that we were sponsoring by the company I was working for. And I finally just got really, really frustrated in getting to run around from the billing company or the billing office and said, well, I'm going to be meeting with your chancellor tomorrow. And if we don't get this straightened out today, I'm going to talk to him about this. They got straightened out real fast. But I was lucky. I happened to be in a position to handle that. Most people are not. So there are mistakes that are made. And if someone is actually coming to you and complaining about a bill, keep in mind that there are mistakes sometimes. And even though, as I said last week, the customer may not always be right, but he is the customer, you need to be able to explain to them why something is correct. If you can't explain why it's correct, then you need to refer them on to somebody who can. Or you need to refer it to someone who can fix it if it's not correct. So that's, but keeping a calm demeanor is key, is an important key to being successful at that. So that's one of the reasons that we are doing some minor accounting. And also when you look at EHR Go, you'll have a link in that assignment that takes you into the patient's records for this class. Of course, they're fictional patients, but they're the patient record for this class. So when you are doing that, play around with it, take a look at it, get used to using it, because you will be using EHR Go in future classes here on your program. So that's actually pretty good. The stuff we had before that was pathetic. So we like having this. It seems. You gonna live, B? Just in case. Okay. So right now, I guess we'll just go on to looking at this week's assignment pages. And for those of you watching online, I'm going to bring it up here. Okay, so this one is about flow rates. And flow rates, whenever you hear the term flow rate, you're talking about an infusion. Now, remember, there are two approaches to parenteral administration of drugs. One is a bolus injection, and a bolus injection basically means you pierce the skin, you push the contents of the syringe into the body, and you pull the needle out. Now, there's a couple of things. Bolus is how we give intramuscular and subcutaneous injections. In other words, we poke the needle in, we push the contents into the body and pull the needle out. That is a bolus injection. We can give IVs, which is going directly into the vein, which means we are pushing this material into the blood system, into the circulatory system. This is the fastest way to get a drug action because you have put it immediately into the blood system. Within a couple of minutes, it has circulated throughout the entire body. Okay, it's the fastest route of administration. Again, you can do it by bolus or you can do it over time. And there are many kinds of drugs that we give bolus. If you've ever had an IV injection of something like an opioid for extreme pain, it's always done in bolus form. And there are two ways of doing a bolus. There's fast bolus and slow bolus. A fast bolus is you just squeeze it right in. I will tell you that that is an unpleasant experience for the patient because the interior, the lumen, the lining of our blood vessels, does not like having stuff that isn't blood going into it. And when you push it in real fast, then you've displaced the blood, and what the lumen is feeling is this medication. It's almost always very painful. If, however, you take what we call a slow bolus. Now, a slow bolus is not what you might think from the term. Instead of going squirt, you take about 2 seconds to empty your syringe. 2 seconds is not a lot of time, but what happens in that 2 seconds is the material is going into the bloodstream and is being immediately diluted into the flowing blood and does not come in direct contact with the lumen and therefore cause that painful reaction. Okay, so unfortunately, a lot of medical practitioners do not think about that. They're always in a hurry. Some of the most impatient and hurried people I know are nurses, and they just go in and squirt. And occasionally you may have to say, please take it easy. That's very painful. Now the pain doesn't last long, but it doesn't mean it's pleasant. So we have the slow bolus, and then we have the infusion. Infusion simply means over time. Usually, when we are given an order for an infusion, we will be told very strict, very carefully, over what period of time the drug will be given. And if it is to be given using the drop per minute or gravity feed, you'll be told sometimes you'll be told the drop rate. You'll also be told what kind of equipment you have. Now, let me talk a little about the equipment for infusion. Infusion pumps have been around forever, at least almost as long as I've been alive. And they generally run at some number of milliliters per hour in full milliliter units. There are pumps that have come on board in recent years that can deliver as low as tenths of milliliters. But these pumps are much more expensive and they're not very common yet. So you'll probably, if you ever deal with an infusion pump, it'll probably be milliliters per minute. I suggest, I don't know if you guys do this, but anytime you visit someone in the hospital, take a look at what they're hooked up to. I'm kind of nosy when I've got, when I've got family or friends in the hospital, I always look at what they're getting. I'll go read the label on the IV bags. I will look at the equipment just to see what they're doing. And part of it is just sort of keeping up on monitoring what they're receiving, because most people do not have an advocate who has any knowledge of what's going on in the hospital. But the other is just to see where the technology is going, because just about every time I see these things, there's something new that's there. Fortunately, I don't have a whole lot of direct experience with that equipment, but like most people, I've had some. But it is to me, it's interesting to see what is appearing. So you'll look at these. So mostly we're going to be, all of our calculations here for infusion pumps will be in milliliters per hour, in whole milliliters per hour. When we are using a pump, there's a couple of rules of thumb here when doing infusions. If we're using a pump, it really doesn't matter where it is. It could be on the floor because you're using a mechanical device to push things into the body. If, however, we're using manual delivery, gravity feed, dropwise delivery, then the bag has to be at least 36 inches above the heart. Now, why is that? Well, when the heart beats, it has a pressure. What we're making certain is that there is no chance that when the heart beats, that pressure is pushing blood into the IV line rather than stuff coming out. So if the bag were, 36 inches is a lot of extra margin. If it's only 30, it probably is not a problem. You get down to where it's only a foot, 12 inches, and it could be a problem. If you are below the heart, you are going to have a problem. Okay. So we hang the bag. If the patient is lying in a bed, it's one thing, because their heart and the IV location in their arm, generally their arm, although it could be other places as well, will be not a problem. If they are sitting up, then we have to make sure the bag is high enough. And there we calculate drops per minute. Now, what's a drop? How big is a drop? Well, we actually have 4 different kinds of what we call venoclysis sets. I'm going to throw that word up here for those who are listening Venoclysis. Venoclysis is basically delivery through the vein, is all that means. And they come pre-calibrated as to the number of drops per milliliter that come out, because we still have to calculate a milliliter rate for these things. So we have, remember that drop is abbreviated GTT. Some people will write drops, and that's fine, but if you see the term GTT, that means drops. Okay, our venoclysis sets come in several different rates of delivery in terms of drops per milliliter. We've got 10 drops per milliliter, 15 drops per milliliter, 20 drops per milliliter, and 60 drops per milliliter. And this is called the micro venoclysis set. The 60 drop per milliliter is called a micro set. So when do we use which ones? Well, hospitals won't necessarily carry all of these, and doctors' offices for certain won't carry all of these because they're expensive. These are sterile apparatus. They have to be. You're putting stuff directly into the venous system. Blood is a wonderful culture medium for microorganisms, viruses, fungus, bacteria, parasites, any of them. So this material is delivered in sterile packaging. We wear sterile gloves when we're using them. So anything that actually goes into the body is sterile. The material that we inject is supposed to be sterile. It's manufactured under sterile conditions, and that's one of the reasons it's so expensive. It's a very expensive process to manufacture anything under sterile conditions. So we have these three sets. Now what that means is if we calculate a number of milliliters per minute, okay? So our results of the calculation is going to be milliliters per minute, because the drug comes in milliliters, not drops, right? Comes in a volume. So we calculate that, and then depending on the apparatus we use, so we're going to call this, what we call this is the drop factor of our apparatus. It comes labeled. So we have drop factor of 10, 15, 20, and 60. I'm going to call this DF. So then we simply multiply this milliliters per minute times the drop factor. The drop factor, so our milliliters per minute times drops per milliliter. Milliliters cancel out, and what we have is drops per minute. Okay? And it depends on the apparatus. Rule of thumb is if you are injecting less than 1 milliliter a minute, you will use the micro apparatus. Why is that? Well, if you use 10 drops per milliliter apparatus, and you were doing 1 milliliter a minute, say a half a milliliter a minute, which is not uncommon. Half a milliliter a minute, you would write 0.5 milliliter per minute times 10 drops per milliliter is going to be 5 drops per minute. Well, these things are set and the nurses count the drops. Some of them have little calibrated things, but you can't believe the calibrations by rote. So if we're 1 drop a minute off, then our dose is off by 20%, by 1 out of 5. That's unacceptable. The standard in medicine is acceptable when you are delivering drugs using things that are not perfectly accurate, is if you can get within 10% of the dose, it's okay. Okay is not good enough. I don't know if you've seen those AT&T commercials on television where they've got the doctor who comes in and he says, "Oh, I've been reinstated. I'm okay." Okay is not good enough. We want better. So we use more. Obviously, we could use the 20 apparatus and calculate it at 10 drops per minute. If we're off by 1, we're 10%. That's good enough? No, we don't like that. So if we're off even by a couple, if we're using the 60, we're going to calculate 0.5 times 60 is 30 drops per minute. If we're off a drop, we're like 3%. That's not bad. It's acceptable. We can be off actually a couple of drops and still be acceptable. And what happens is they will dial the venoclysis set. Should see if we have one as an example. I'll see about that maybe on the break. We have a venoclysis set that has a little dial on it that you can set the rate, and it's sort of, a lot of them are sort of calibrated, but you don't trust them. You don't just accept that it's going to work. So the nurses will set that and count. Nurses are used to doing that, and anybody who takes pulses, which medical assistants do, are used to that. You count for 15 or 30 seconds, and then you multiply by the appropriate factor. If you're counting for 15 seconds, you multiply by 4, that gives you the number per minute. 30 seconds, multiply by 2, you get the right number, okay? So we are very used to doing that, right? But we have to have an accurate count. And it's easy to be off. Now, if you're off by 1 count on a pulse, it probably isn't very important because pulse rates vary all over the map. If you're off by a drop out of 30, nobody's going to notice. But so we choose these. A lot of times, an apparatus will be specified. Now you notice that I use 10 and 20, but not 15. That's because 0.5 times 15 is 7.5. We can't count a half a drop. And rounding off is getting awfully close to our 10% margin. So we try to use an apparatus that will give us a whole number. Okay. Now, as I say, a lot of times that'll be specified. And in your problems, you will have that specification in this week's homework. So that's the basis. So the getting to a milliliter per minute is again, a number of milliliters per minute is easy to do. But that drop factor conversion needs to be pretty accurate. Now, you may calculate a fractional number of milliliters per minute, and that's not unusual. Don't do your rounding off until the very last step in your calculations, because rounding is introducing error. And if you round at every step, you're introducing error at every step, and those errors become cumulative. So never round off until the very last calculation you have to do, and then round off. Okay. Nurses are pretty good. They can get to the whatever number you calculate, and you're going to calculate some oddball numbers sometimes. That's okay. The nurses are generally really good. They're well trained. They understand the necessity for being as accurate as possible. Okay, so it's time for our first break. Let's take our 10 minutes, and we'll come back and pick up this topic when we're back in the room. Okay, so let's resume. I'm gonna have you guys take a look at this. Is a venoclysis set. It gets, the way we set IVs is to first off install essentially it's a catheter, a syringe type catheter into a vein like this one here on my arm, which, as you can see, is pretty prominent. And how anybody could miss it, I don't know, but they do. But we install that, and then the venoclysis set gets put into that catheter, attached to it. We open that at the last minute. The sterilization is a gas called ethylene oxide, which kills viruses and bacteria as it breaks down, as it comes in contact with us. Ethylene oxide is an extremely reactive gas. So it destroys bacteria, viruses, etc., when it comes in contact with them. So it gets set up, and you can see that little adjustment piece on the side there, which is how they set the number of drops. Okay. Partially, some of them, I didn't take a close look at that. Some of them are partially calibrated so that you can get close and then adjust from there. Also, nurses get experience with these, and they're able to get things pretty well done. So that is how we deliver these. When we're using a pump, we don't need that set, obviously, because we're not adjusting anything. We set the pump. So there is a line that goes into the pump. The pump is what we call a peristaltic pump. What it is a series of roller balls that just act like peristalsis in the gut to move things down the line of the set of the IV. So the systems work pretty well. You're dependent on gravity. If you are in many situations where you are adding where you're adding a drug to an existing line, it may go in by dropwise administration, or it just may be attached to an IV bag. So that's what they look like. They're of such a length that you can get that bag at least 3 feet above the heart, okay, without putting an extension on the line. So those kinds of equipment are bought sterile. They have an expiration date. We obey expiration dates. This is not like the grocery store. We obey the expiration dates. You see expiration dates or use by dates on food in the grocery store. It just blows me away to see that on a bottle of pickles, because pickling is an ancient preservation tool, and it's essentially, it will last for many years. But our equipment here, we take no chances with anything we are injecting into our patients. We take no chances. So, so that's how that works. Okay. So let's talk about that calculation sheet that I gave you. And a couple, there's just a few things on it that I want you to note. And they are starting on page 2. If we go to page 2 of this document, looking at example, the example there, we will pull this up and take a look at these videos in a little bit. But on page 2, you're going to see a correction. You'll see there calculation of drops per minute, and they calculate 37.5 drops per minute. Now, we can't do 37.5. So we round this off to 38. Okay. So we always round this off. Okay. So there's that one. If you can see this, let me just sort of read this to you. Physician orders normal saline. NS is normal saline. Normal saline is 0.9% sodium chloride. Sodium chloride, you all know as table salt. Sodium chloride, 0.9% sodium chloride is the concentration of sodium chloride in plasma, in our bloodstream. So this is basically giving this liquid to the patient by an IV. It's 150 milliliters per hour IV, and we're using a set that is rated at 15 drops per milliliter. As I said, you'll be told what to use. 15 is generally the go-to choice for most things that don't have to use a micro set, because it's halfway between 10 and 20, basically. And a lot of places will have that for the regular. So we've got milliliters per hour. Note that the physician's going to order it per hour rather than per minute. So we have to convert then the number of we have to convert that milliliters per hour to milliliters per minute. We all know that there's 60 minutes in an hour. So we simply multiply the number of hours by 60 and come up with a number of minutes, in this case 60. And if we do the addition here, we can count, or we do the division, we can divide 60 into 150, and we get 2.5 milliliters per minute. That allows us to confirm that it's appropriate to use a 15 drop per milliliter apparatus, since it's more than 1 milliliter a minute. So then we simply multiply that 2.5 times 15 to get 37.5. Now, the instructions here, the calculations here, the method that they use is to make things, I think, a little more difficult. I would do this stepwise. I would divide, figure out the number of number of milliliters per minute, and then multiply by the drop factor. They set it up as one long calculation that comes up with the same answer. Stepwise calculations allow you to think through the logic of what you're doing. And the logic here that I use is convert to milliliters per minute first, and then multiply by the drop factor. That's the same thing as setting up a bigger calculation. So if you're comfortable with the unit calculation, that's fine, do it. But I find that until you get comfortable with that, it's best to do it stepwise. Okay. You're going to get the same answer. Okay. But again, this also one advantage that they have with using a unified calculation is that you're not tempted to do any rounding at each stage. So, but remember, anytime you're doing calculations, don't round off till the last calculation has been made. Okay, so let's go to page 4 now. And we're going to look at example, the first example on page 4, which is a calculation of a number of units of heparin. Remember, units are just another measure of potency, so we don't care that it's units instead of milligrams. So he's ordered heparin over 24 hours. And what they're doing is asking, they haven't given you a venoclysis set. So this is going to be done by pump. Okay. So they want you to calculate a number of units and a number of milliliters per hour. So they're going through this, and they're doing this as, again, a stepwise calculation. 1,000 units over 24 hours. If you divide 1,000 by 24, you're going to get 41.67 units per hour. Okay. Then we're going to look at how many units then, how many milliliters per hour they're doing. So they take this and they do it as in the following manner. They have calculated that D is 41.67 units per hour. So let's look at that and relate that to our formula of dV over H. Remember, D times V over H is what we are calculating. In this case, again, we're looking at how do we do this calculation. There are several ways we can do it. The handout that you have carries it out as calculating. Since we are using a pump, we want to know how much the patient is going to get in an hour. Okay? So we're calculating that dose. So we have a couple of other things to think about here. So we are going to look at the instructions and look at what the pharmacy has. So the dose is 1,000 units in 24 hours. The pharmacy has 1,000 units, bags of 1,000 units of heparin in 500 milliliters of normal saline. So if we look at the label on that, we've got 1,000 units And remember, we never abbreviate the word unit. We always write it out. Per 500 milliliters NS. Now, in terms of our calculations, we don't care that it's in normal saline. In terms of the patient, we do, but normal saline is irrelevant. Okay? So that is, so we've calculated that we're going to give 1,000 units over 24 hours. And we've calculated that at 41.67 units per hour. Okay. Right? Yeah, that's the number. So this is D. Okay. This is D. 500 milliliters is V, and 1,000 units is H. How do we know that? Because that's on the label. Again, we have had to take what the doctor has prescribed and do a small calculation first to calculate the hourly dose. Remember that D is each dose. When we are looking at infusion therapy, either when we're using an infusion pump, then D is the amount the patient's going to receive in each hour. If we are using gravity feed, drop-wise addition, manual feed, then D is the amount the patient receives every minute. Okay, that's what we're after. So the rate now becomes substituting this, these values that we've calculated and that we've read off the label into our dV over H, 41.67 units per hour times 500 milliliters divided by 1,000 units. Okay, and that's that formula that you see in this example. In step 2, 41.67 units divided by 1,000 units times 500 milliliters. So that's just dV over H. Okay, so we calculate that out now, and we get 20.84 milliliters per hour. Okay, because units have canceled out, the only thing left is milliliters per hour. Okay, 20.84. Now, we can't set our pump to 20.84. So we round it off. That's left out of here. This now becomes 21 milliliters per hour. And that's how it's dosed. We dial it in on the pump and turn the pump on, make sure it's running, and then walk away. Now, just as a bit of safety precaution that we need to be aware of, these pumps have alarms on them. If the bag runs out, the alarm goes off. If for some reason the pump stops running, the alarm goes off. But we set this up for that delivery. And this has been set up to run for 24 hours because we've calculated that early on in terms of the number of units the patient will receive in an hour. So if you multiply 21 times 24, because that's the number of milliliters per hour times the number of hours per day, it should be approximately 500. In fact, it's 504. Yeah. So again, well within our 10% number. And again, that's a good check to see that you've done the calculation correctly. Is it going to deliver the volume required in the time that it's being delivered? Okay. So that's the next correction. That last number at step 3 is going to be 21 milliliters per hour. Okay. Now let's run over to page 6. Page 6 is related to the concept of what we call the day's supply, the quantity to dispense. Basically, we know how to calculate the amount per dose, dV over H. We know how to read the numbers. We know how to calculate that. The total quantity that is given to a patient is sufficient to provide the daily dose and for the entire duration prescribed in the prescription. Remember, the prescription has several components: name of the drug, amount per dose, route of administration, frequency of dosing, and finally, the duration of the prescription in days. So our calculation becomes dV over H tells us only what the patient gives for a single dose. So we take that number, multiply it by the frequency of dosing, and then multiply it by the number of days to get the total amount dispensed. Okay. We can also go back and calculate something called the number of days supplied by simply dividing by, again, multiplying the number of units per dose times the frequency, dividing that into the total quantity dispensed. It's a good way to check to see that we've gotten the proper number of days supply. Now, I don't know if you know this already from experience or anything else, but when you pick up a drug from a pharmacy, one of the things you should do before you even walk out of the pharmacy is open up the prescription bag and check to be sure that you have the right quantity of drug. Pharmacies make mistakes. I had a student a number of years ago who came in just livid because her child was given a prescription for amoxicillin. Her child was old enough to take them orally, so she was given enough of a prescription for amoxicillin, or given a prescription, and she just took what was there and went home, and she had half the amount that she needed because she was in my pharmacy class, and she checked, she counted the pills. She called the pharmacy and they said, well, our records say we gave you the whole thing, so we can't give you anything else. So there she is with a child who was going to get a half a prescription, and there was nothing she could do about it. The risk, of course, is that half a prescription, the child is going to not be cleared of the infection. So, there again, check, take a look, be sure that you're getting what you've paid for, because mistakes get made. Mistakes get made for several reasons. Number one, the pharmacy technician read the prescription wrong, calculated a wrong number of dosage forms to count out, and then assumed that they were right. The pharmacist should have checked it. I can tell you that pharmacists, when they have enough experience, can look at a pill bottle and tell you if the number's correct. Now, they can't tell you if a 90-day supply is off by 1 day, but they can certainly see large errors. So pharmacists should be checking that. That should not have been missed by the pharmacist. So what we're doing with this is, let's take a look at the example here on page 6. Patient has been ordered amoxil, which is amoxicillin, 500 milligram BID for 7 days. How many 250 milligram tablets should be dispensed? So the dose, 500 milligrams. Okay, the dosage form, tablet, that's V. H, the potency in each tablet, 250 milligram. Okay. Now there's a warning down here that says dose ordered and dose on hand are different. That's kind of a misleading statement. What it does is let us know that it's perfectly fine for us to calculate some number of tablets that it might be different from what the physician thought you would have. Amoxil comes in 250 and 500 milligram tablet and capsule form for solid dosage forms. But the pharmacies don't necessarily carry both. Drugs are expensive. Inventory costs in pharmacies are horrendous. So they don't carry them. So it's very common to have to recalculate a dose, a number of tablets. Hey, Cody.
How's it going?
What's going on?
Much. How's it going in here?
We're fine, I think.
Good.
Everybody's computer working okay? Good.
Excited about these numbers.
Yeah, numbers. We love them. Numbers make the world go around.
Yeah.
So what we do now is calculate several things. So when we do dV over H, it's going to be 500 times tablet divided by 250. So we're going to have 2 tablets per dose. Twice a day, that's 2 tablets per dose is times 2 is going to be 4 tablets a day. You got a 7-day prescription. We're going to have 4 times 7 or 28 tablets as what we're going to give to the patient. Okay, so that day's supply, that quantity to dispense, is calculated in that fashion. But the first thing you do is a dV over H. Sometimes it's pretty obvious. If it were 500 milligrams BID and you had 500 milligram tablets, that's pretty easy, one at a time. But always write your numbers down and check them, because you don't really want to either give the patient too much, more than they were prescribed, or too little. Okay, so that's the way we calculate those kinds of numbers, quantities to dispense, days supply. We call that days supply, and we give the patient enough for every day of the duration. Now, the correction that I have here is a minor one, but it is one that does need to be put in, and that is on problem 15 at the bottom of the page. Patient's been ordered oxycodone 5 milligram Q4H. It should be PO. There is no such thing as PA for 5 days. So that's those are the 3 minor corrections on this week's homework. Okay. So questions? Okay, I want to just talk about this this one page quickly. Is any of this not clear how we do this? Okay, so the key in all of this is knowing what the dose is, what D is. So I want to go back and just talk about a few of these questions that are on here. Okay. Actually, the first question needs to have a couple other words in it. A physician assistant prescribes. Okay, we'll just add that. $250 milliliters of D5NS. Now, let's talk about the kinds of carrier solutions we use when we're giving IV therapy. There are lots of things we work with in preparing medications. There is a whole list, but the most common ones are going to be what we call sterile WFI. Sterile WFI means sterile water for injection. It comes in vials. Vials are a form of little bottle that has a rubber septum in the top and is surrounded, that's held in place by a metal ring. It is meant to be poked with a needle. And it comes in two different types of presentation. One is bacteriostatic, meaning it has a preservative in it. And that means that we can pierce that septum multiple times. So we can use it, we can use the contents of those bottles several times. When we're doing the injections, teaching injections here, one of the things that we have is we use normal saline because I'll tell you, if you were injected with just sterile water for injection, that would hurt like crazy. The body hates that stuff. It wants the salt. So we use normal saline. And we use bacteriostatic normal saline because we're injecting small amounts into you and we're taking them out of 10 to 30 milliliter vials. So we will use that. We also have single-use containers that have no preservative in them. Okay, and those can be either smaller vials or what we call an ampule. And an ampule is a funny shaped device that has a little restriction and then like a nipple at the top that's sealed off. They're always preservative free. They can be opened. You break them at this little juncture right here and filter the contents out through a filtering needle, because when you break it, glass shards often end up inside the vial or inside the ampule. So that's another common device that we have, another common delivery system, but it's always single use. Ampules can be anywhere from 1 milliliter up to 50. Okay. All right, so we have sterile water for injection. We also have normal saline, 0.9%, sodium chloride, and I'm going to be lazy and use the chemist notation for that. Okay. We also have 1/2 NS, which is 0.45% sodium chloride. Okay. We have something called D5W, which is 5% dextrose in water. Okay. D5W. We also have D10W, D50W, D70W that we use for other purposes. But these are all sterilized solutions. This is used in a lot of cases when you go into a hospital. They won't hook you up to normal saline as a rule unless there's a reason for it, but they will hook you up to D5W because they're trying to get nutrition into you. Especially if you go in for surgery, you're going to be NPO, nothing by mouth after a certain time. Usually midnight, sometimes 12 hours. If you have a very early surgery like 6 a.m., it might be 6 p.m. the previous night. But they will give you that so that you actually have some nutrition going into you, something to give you energy for healing. Okay? We also have something called LR. This is called lactated ringers solution. Ringers solution was developed by Dr. Ringer as a better, originally as a blood substitute before they understood that we needed the red blood cells, but also as a way of having the plasma components. There are many things that are mixed into ringers, salts and sugars and proteins and other things that were normally a part of our, that are normally a part of our plasma, as a means of dealing, first off, with people who are having severe bleeding. Severe bleeding causes a drop in blood pressure. Significant drop in blood pressure is shock. And when that blood pressure drops, the heart responds by starting to beat much faster and harder. And it will continue to do so until it moves into the uncontrolled beating we call fibrillation. And we don't like that because people die because of that. So what we do is we try to keep the volume of the circulatory system up with an appropriate liquid to keep the heart from moving into that fibrillation state. Okay, so that's what you see when, and sometimes you see it on TV shows, medical shows, they'll call it Ringer's lactate, but officially it's lactated Ringers. It has lactase in it. There's a Ringers without the lactose. We found that it works better if we have lactose in it. The OSE, by the way, ending indicates a sugar. Dextrose is a sugar. Sugars are a classification of molecule like sucrose, glucose. These are all sugars. There are hundreds of sugars. Fructose, mannose, all sorts of them. Galactose. We have lots and lots of sugars. Sugars are a very specific class of molecules. We use them, and we can use them not totally interchangeably. Sucrose is the easiest of the sugars to metabolize. And dextrose is next. So we have, these are the main ones. There are more. We have D5NS, which is D5W plus normal saline. And we can have D5 half NS as well. So there are lots of these things. The doctor will specify the carrier he wants. You will not see sterile water for injection as a carrier. However, you will see it used for doing things like preparing the IV bags, because a lot of drugs cannot be sent in solution. Water, besides being one of the most necessary substances for life, is also a very destructive substance. Just ask a mountain range that's been converted to a beach by water cycling, water freezing cycles. It's a very destructive substance. And chemically, it destroys a lot of different things. The original penicillin was not capable of being delivered as a prepared liquid because storage in water for any length of time destroyed it. Amoxicillin, which many of you have experience with, comes as a dry powder and is reconstituted. Since it's going to be an oral, it's reconstituted with distilled water rather than sterile. So we do, because, and again, you're told to use it within 14 days and keep it in the fridge, because water will destroy the active ingredient in amoxil, which is amoxicillin. So a lot of things are shipped as powders. That's why we reconstitute them. After reconstitution, we put them into an IV bag. Some will come actually set up with an IV bag, and all you have to do is connect everything up and boom, it's mixed. But we often have to inject it into the IV bag. But we prepare these things. So we have all of these different potential diluents, we call them, for our drug. They are delivery vehicles. Sometimes they're given on their own. All of these, under the right conditions, or maybe I should say the wrong conditions because people are sick and need them, can be given on their own. So we will see things like this particular example here on page 1. Let's go back up to page 1. Physician assistants prescribes 250 milliliters of D5NS over 5 hours. How many milliliters per hour will the patient receive? Well, this is a pretty simple, this is not really a DV over H calculation. Always look, when you look at a word problem like this, always ask yourself, what is the answer they're looking for? And I don't mean the number, but what is the question? In this case, they're asking only milliliters per hour. So the very simplest way to do that, okay, you got 250 milliliters in 5 hours. Simply divide, right? Now, we go down to number 2. Flow rate is the same thing, milliliters per hour. And here we're only giving normal saline. Okay, so again, remember, you may have to convert when they're asking for just flow rate, assume it's milliliters per hour. If they don't give you a drop factor apparatus, it's milliliters per hour. You may be given the prescription in minutes. Convert minutes to hours. How do you convert minutes to hours? Anybody want to answer that one? How do you convert minutes to hours? divide by 60. X number of minutes over 60 minutes per hour gives you hours. Right, that's all. So again, just remembering those simple relationships, 60 minutes per hour, is really critical. Sometimes they make it easy by giving you hours, but in a lot of times they won't. Okay, let's move down to page 2. Okay. Again, we're looking at a physician ordering D5W 250 milliliters over 6 hours using a 20 drop per milliliter administration set. That tells you that what you want to know first is how many milliliters per minute is the patient going to get. Anytime you're using a drop rated administration set, you have to be calculating milliliters per minute. You know, write that down as a rule. So over 6 hours, obviously you have to first convert hours to minutes. So how do you convert hours to minutes? Well, if you divide hours over minutes over 60, that number is going to be hours per minute. That doesn't tell us anything. So if we are looking at converting minutes to hours, we divide. Hours to minutes, we multiply. So just think about this. 1 hour is 60 minutes. So 2 hours must be 2 times 60. So in this case, we've got 6 hours. And then we divide that into our 250 and calculate milliliters per minute. And then remember what we do after that, we multiply times the drop factor, which they give you in this question. Okay, makes sense? All right, let's look at question number 6 on the next, right at the top of the next page. 10 milliequivalents of potassium chloride and 1,000 milliliters of normal saline over 12 hours. And you're using a 60 drop per milliliter IV administration set. What's the drop rate? Okay, so we don't care what is the irrelevant information here. The irrelevant information, don't get confused, is the 10 milliequivalents of potassium chloride, KCl. That is irrelevant information for this kind of a problem. And I say that because the important thing is we have a volume. We are delivering the entire 1,000 milliliter volume. So we're just using 1,000 milliliters, 12 hours, but we have to calculate a number of minutes. So again, 12 times 60 is going to give us a number. Turns out to be 720 minutes. So again, now we've got 1,000 milliliters in 720 minutes. It's a simple division to see how many milliliters per minute. Multiply the result by 60. That's your drop factor. Okay. And this the same when we're here on the next couple of questions. They tell you the volume. And remember, they are putting, you don't care how much drug the patient is getting per unit of time. You've been told an amount and you've been told a volume. The only important calculation is the volume per either hour or minute. Okay. Okay, so that's using the volume. And it's past time for our second break. We'll come back and talk about the next page, page 4, and the types of calculations there when we get back. Okay. Okay. Let's talk about the stuff that starts on page 4. We went through one example which was example number 1. Let's take a look at example number 2 and go through that calculation now. Practitioner orders 1 milliequivalent of potassium chloride per hour over 8 hours. Pharmacy sends you a bag that has 10 milliequivalents of potassium chloride in 1,000 milliliters of normal saline. What is the flow rate? Okay. So what we have is to look at that flow rate, what that order is. In this particular case, the dose ordered is 1 milliequivalent per hour. Okay. So what we're looking at is that is D. So we're looking at, in this case, the number a number that is going to make us possible to use our formula. dV over H. Okay, so we've got 1 milliequivalent potassium chloride per hour. Okay. We want to know a flow rate. They don't give us a venoclysis set number, so it's a pump. So we want to have an hour. So this 1 milliequivalent per hour is D, because we're calculating the hourly amount the patient's going to get. Now remember the difference, the little somewhat subtle difference here with infusions is our dose is going to be either an amount per hour or an amount per minute, depending on the delivery system. Infusion pumps per hour, venoclysis sets per minute. So there we are given that. We are told that that what the pharmacy supplies is 10 milliequivalents per 1,000 milliliters. Well, 1,000 milliliters is V, 10 milliequivalents is H. Read it off the bag, right? Again, look at the question and determine what you need. Ignore what you don't. In this particular question, pretty much everything in there is needed. But there is going to be other times when it won't. So now we just set it up. It's the dose, 1 milliequivalent. And note that I don't care about the fact that it's potassium chloride. So that doesn't appear in the equation. Times 1,000 milliliters over 10 milliequivalents. Okay. Now, we carry that out. Milliequivalents disappear. So we have 10 goes into 1,100 times. So we have 100 milliliters per hour in milli equivalents per hour. Now, note that it's supposed to be over 8 hours. So the entire bag is not going to be dispensed. And that's perfectly fine. Okay. That's perfectly fine. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So so that is how much we dispense. So if we go down here and look at the related problems, which you're going to be working on. First one is a patient needs 500 milligrams of azithromycin over 4 hours. So if the pharmacy sends you 500 milligrams in 100 milliliters of normal saline, what's the flow rate? First thing you need to do from that 500 milligrams over 4 hours is figure out how much that is per hour. So you figure that out by dividing, right? 500 by 4. That's going to give you a number. That number is D. 500 milligrams in 100 milliliters give you H and V. So you simply set up the calculation that way. Okay. Make sense? Okay, if we go further down on page 5, we'll get to what they call days supply calculations. This is a little different from the last page where we calculated the total dispensed quantity. What we're doing is going back now and just calculating how many days worth of drug have been given to the patient. And we do that by looking at the amount per dose, okay? Or the amount actually dispensed, which if we look at the example here, a patient's been ordered amoxil 875 milligrams BID in the pharmacy, dispensed 875 milligrams. The number 14 is the total quantity given to the patient. That's what that hashtag, it's not a hashtag, it is, or a pound sign, if you can call it that as well. It's not what it is. It tells us that the number of tablets to be given to the patients is 14. Sometimes that's specified by the physician on the prescription, as we saw the first week of class. How many days will it last? So he's been given 14 tablets. So how many tablets per day? Well, again, we've got one tablet, obviously. We can go through and calculate the number of tablets per dose by using dV over H. Okay. So in this particular case, we would calculate D as 875, V as, well, it doesn't say, but it's a tablet, and H is 875. So the number per dose is going to be 1. And then the number of doses per day is 2. So he's taking 2 tablets a day. So this is a week's worth, 7 days. Yeah. So it's pretty easy to calculate. So we look down, the next one is the drug Haldol, 1 milligram by mouth twice a day, 28 tablets. But the tablets are 0.5 milligrams. So we have to go back and calculate the number of tablets per dose first. I mean, it's pretty, probably can do that in your head. But get used to thinking of it in terms of DV over H, because sometimes the numbers are not going to be that easy. Okay. And also remember that a dose prescribed can be a half a tablet or even a third of a tablet. Okay. So again, the key is first calculating the number of dosing units per dose. Okay. It's not terribly different for liquids. We look at number 13, amoxil 375 milligram PO BID. They're going to dispense 150 milliliters of amoxil, which is 250 milligrams in every 5 milliliters. So we calculate, in this case, normally speaking, we would tell the patient to take a number of teaspoons, but in the pharmacy, we don't think that way. We think in terms of milliliters. So what we want to do is calculate the number of milliliters per dose. We've got a dose of 375, and we've got, note that we ignore the 150 for this part of the problem for finding out DV over H. So we've got 250 milligrams in 5 milliliters tells us H and V. So we simply set that up, figure out how many milliliters per dose. It's going to be BID dosing, so we double that per day and then divide that into our 150. So keep in mind that these are pretty, please don't make them harder than they are. It's real easy to overthink these. Keep some basic principles in mind when solving all of your problems. But the principles change with the type of problem, remember that. But DV over H is central to all of them. So first you want to know D, what is D? And we define it differently in different settings. Obviously, we define D differently for infusion therapy than for oral therapy. But think of it as, in infusion therapy, think of it as D being the amount the patient is going to receive per hour if it's a pump, or per minute if it's by a set. Okay. Is that making sense to everybody? Any questions? Okay. So we already talked about the rest of that. So that's pretty straightforward stuff. Let's go back to the module here and take a look. So this week we have, as I said before, our two different discussions. One is about the role of the medical assistant in accounting. You may want to just do a little bit of online research, but you can read what I posted first and maybe even look at my references. You can also, do you all have the big medical assisting book, the big black one? Take a look at what's in there about medical assisting and accounting, because in the first section, when they're talking about office work, they do have some stuff about accounting. So read that material. The next discussion is dosages and flow rates for parenteral administration, what we have just been talking about. So there's some material there. And here you're going to look at calculation errors. okay? And you're going to have to go online and find a medication error example where a wrong parenteral dose was given. You can look up medication errors. You can look up and use a search engine to search for parenteral medication errors. And you will find plenty. Okay, so find one. Read it, discuss it, look at ways that, that it could have been avoided, and make some suggestions as to how you can avoid those things, okay? And think about, in the case of an error, what recourse is there? Now, there are some very much horror stories about this, including people injecting patients with cleaning fluid. And you wonder how that can happen. And then you find out that somebody was cleaning stuff and left the cleaning fluid on the medicine tray. You know, that's pretty obvious how you could have avoided that. But it killed the patient. So you'll find some things that are kind of scary. And when you realize that you know, these errors, remember, when we know something like an error, by definition, it's preventable. And so we need to think about how we can prevent these things from happening. It's really unfortunate that as many of them as happen do. And again, all can be prevented by simply being careful. You know, you look at something like that cleaning fluid injection, and your first reaction is, how on earth could it happen? Well, it did. And there's no excuse for it. Even if the stuff was left on the tray, the person preparing the dose should have looked at the label. Oh, cleaning fluid, I'm not injecting that. Why is it here? But obviously people don't look. You know, I had a policeman one time tell me that in at least 35% of all automobile accidents, there is absolutely no evidence that any of the involved parties took any evasive action. That to me is kind of scary. That many people are out there on the road who aren't paying enough attention to try and get out of the way, you know, but it happens. Okay, so remember, you have to have a citation, and please include the in-text citation to the reference. Okay, and remember, we have you know, both of these discussions. Also, you're supposed to be responding to your fellow students. So do that, please. I know people work, I know they're busy, but it's part of the requirement. Okay, questions? So you'll find that I've already written some things on both of these discussions. I will figure out some stuff for us to do as an in-class activity when we have all 5 of us here on Thursday. And then we've just went through the assignment. Remember that the assignment is followed by doing the quiz online. Basically, plug in your answers. Okay, and then do the assessment. I suggest, again, the assessment can be done 3 times. So you can go through it. You know, my strategy would be to go through it, get ready, do a little bit of studying and be prepared, do the other material first, go through it and see what you have to go back and review, and then do it again. And then you have your third try. But remember, there will be some written answers that I will have to grade. So if you don't see a grade, or you think you've done it right and it tells you you're wrong, let me grade it before you worry about it. Okay. Any other questions or comments for this week? Okay. So Paul and Michaela, I want you to watch this and send me an email with a code word in it. And the code word will be Paris, P-A-R-I-S. That will tell me that you've watched it. And I will remind you by email that you need to do this before Thursday, because our in-class activity will include what we've been doing.